Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Watch Dogs running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now this is currently running at 1080p with the lowest graphics preset. Overall, the averages that we're getting are just slightly above 30, we're barely under 40 really. And the 1% lows are above 30 at 35. Now what this tells you is that we're actually getting very consistent performance. This is really what I've been finding the most about the AMD processor as I've been testing it compared to the i5. It tends to maybe not necessarily have much higher FPS, but it has much better 1% lows, and the frame times are usually way more consistent. So the experience of playing games even at lower FPSs tends to be smoother on here than on the i5. This is really playable. Because of those frame times being so consistent, it ends up being a very enjoyable gaming experience. We're pretty much getting a better experience with 1080p low here than we were getting at 720p low with the 1135 G7, because even then at 720p the frame times were very inconsistent in that we were just constantly getting spikes all over the place. It was just not this smooth of an experience at all. This right here very much feels like a extremely smooth gaming experience. This you could get away with playing like this. Turning things down to 720p though does net us a pretty decent performance increase. The 1% lows don't necessarily uplift significantly, but the FPS average does go higher, and we are now getting an above 60 FPS experience most of the time. So for the most part, it is going to be a noticeably smoother experience, and you're going to have a probably easier time playing the game like this. Though overall, the gaming experience between 1080p and 720p isn't going to be so drastic that I feel like 720p is required. If you can comfortably get away with the FPS in 1080p, then by all means go ahead. Really, the biggest advantage to 720p though is that it actually presents you with some headroom to start adjusting some settings. In fact, here you see the game actually running at 720p with all of the settings turned to the highest. So this is ultra preset. The only thing that hasn't been adjusted is the AA. So the AA is still FXAA. And the texture setting is actually set to the default, which is just like, I think, normal quality. But you can actually adjust that and set it to the highest, and it had no performance impact whatsoever. Although because this is just 8 GB of RAM, you could just err on the side of caution and just leave it at the normal. I didn't really notice much of a difference turning up the textures honestly anyway, but with everything set to the highest possible settings at ultra at 720p, we are getting pretty much a 30 FPS gaming experience, which is kind of crazy to think that we are getting essentially a better experience than playing this on the consoles when they first came out, and you're playing it at a higher resolution than what most of the consoles back then were able to run it at. Because a lot of people don't seem to really know that like the older consoles like the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and the Xbox One and the PS4 tended to upscale games a lot. They tended to actually run them at less than 720p resolution most of the time. In fact, towards the end of the life cycle of like the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, some of the games were running at like sub 360p, just being upscaled up to like 1080p. Which is why if you ever bust out any of those old consoles and try to look at what the games were actually running at and what they look like, they tend to be kind of a blurry mess nowadays. So it's funny to think that those were considered like the first generation of HD consoles when they were really just running games at like less than 720p. But as for how this chip runs this game, it runs it really well. I'm very impressed. If I had to choose one of these different settings to play at though, I would more than likely just go with 1080p low or 720p high. Ultra is really unnecessary here, and this is actually even beyond ultra, because ultra doesn't even set the ambient occlusion this aggressively. This is the most aggressive form of ambient occlusion you could put on, and even then it's still giving us a playable FPS. It's kind of crazy to think that this runs really well on a chip like this. Now the biggest limiting factor here is of course the fact that we can't really use any AA without murdering the performance here, but if you're willing to go with some lower graphics settings, you can actually turn on a little bit of AA to just fix some of the jagged edges that become very prominent in 720p. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.